Today I am introducing the second part of the installment of the discussions with Richard Trask, our archivist. This will be a multi-part presentation of Danvers history as narrated by Richard Trask and produced by Mark Zuberek with support of DCAT. And this will be part 2 of many parts to come. Topics of the Town will be presenting this special report on a weekly basis because we have it all recorded. Now it's a matter of producing it and sending it out for your consumption. This second segment is more related to the favorite subject of Mr. Trask, witchcraft. And he is very fluent in the discussion of witchcraft, and I have listened intently to his analysis and his presentation of the witchcraft hysteria that happened in 1692. And it continued for almost a year or two, and you'll see the issues that have crept up because of hysteria that developed among the colonists. So, welcome to the show and enjoy our discussion, and we'll flow it into part 3 coming up the following week. Thank you for watching and enjoy the show.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Salem witchcraft is that when it began in March of 1692 with the first people accused of practicing witchcraft, the government really wasn't formally functioning. In 1692, the province of Massachusetts had lost its charter. It had been revoked. And the charter is the thing that basically it's similar to, but not exactly, the Constitution.
Right.
So in 1692, Increase Mather, who was a very powerful and influential minister from Boston, also an intellectual and a scientist of sorts, had gone over to England, and they were waiting on the King and the Privy Council to give Massachusetts a new charter, which would be a royal charter. Prior to that, Massachusetts had pretty much done whatever they wanted, so long as it was not contrary to the rules and regulations of England. So he went over there, and there was kind of a provisional government going on. A fellow named Simon Bradstreet was an older man who lived in Salem, who had been in the political arena for many years, was the temporary governor, but there wasn't any legislature, and they were kind of on tenterhooks to try to decide what to do, especially with all of these new witchcraft cases occurring. So what they did was the local magistrates, and in the case of Salem witchcraft, it was John Hathon and Jonathan Corwin, who were local magistrates from Salem, came over to Salem Village, and there were 3 people accused of witchcraft. Tituba, who was a slave of Reverend Samuel Parris, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and they had been cried out upon, and what were they going to do with them? Well, they had a preliminary hearing here in now Danvers, that time Salem Village, at the village meeting house, which was located right across the street of where our witchcraft memorial is today on Hobart Street. And what they were going to do is try to determine whether or not these people accused, there was enough evidence to hold them. And all they could do is hold them because There wasn't any formal legal government, and they had to wait for the charter to return with Increase Mather and hopefully the new governor. So they did the examination, and they found that, Tituba confessed to witchcraft and said a number of others were also involved. The other two didn't confess, but they kind of said, well, maybe that one is, but I'm not. So it was decided to hold them, and they held them at first in Salem jail, and they kind of waited for developments. But as time went on, from March to April to early May, more and more people were being accused, and all they could do is have these preliminary hearings to decide whether or not they should be held for potential trial. And then in May, a ship arrived in Boston with Increase Mather and the new governor, and he was William Phipps, Sir William Phipps. He was an American-born, one of, I think, 12 children, and he had been an adventurer who was able to have men that he hired dive to a ship that had been wrecked in the West Indies, and they picked up all sorts of gold and silver from the ship. A portion of it went to the crown, so they made him Sir because he had given so much money. So he was an American appointed by the king to be the new governor of the Massachusetts province. So he arrives, and suddenly he sees there's 40 people in jail accused of witchcraft, and he has to do something. The legislature hasn't been formed yet, so what am I going to do? So what he did was he formed a special court called a Court of Oyer Interminer to hear and determine. And they had these kind of special courts every once in a while, and they were set up basically to take care of cases, multiple cases that were related one way or another. So the witchcraft cases were. So he set this court up. Many say afterwards that it was set up illegally because the legislature had not been formed yet, nor had the judicial system. And there were a lot of Indian problems up north, down east. And I think partially to escape all of the political bickering down here and all the witches being discovered, he'd led an expedition to Pemaquid, Maine, to fight the Indians. And so this special court was established. It was composed of men who had been in the judicial legislative area in the past. William Stoughton, who was a minister, although not ordained to a church. So, and he believed very much in the idea of witchcraft being a real thing. So he was the like the chairman of this commission, and about 7 or 8 others were appointed. Samuel Sewell of Boston, William Saltonstall of Haverhill, and the commission that they were given was to hear and determine whether or not these people accused were in fact witches. And the actual trials began in June. There might have been some indictments in May, I can't remember offhand, but in June the trials began. And most people think of the Salem witchcraft as kind of a kangaroo court, that the judges were hanging judges. Well, to a point that's true. However, what they established in trying the so-called witches was according to the best principles in Old England. And I never realized that until maybe 15 years ago when we were putting a book together on all of the documents from 1692, and we were able to actually hold and research the original documents themselves. And on those documents we found a lot of stuff indicating that these were used by the grand jury, they had grand juries, and by the trial jury itself. And very fast justice. Today we think justice is so cumbersome and long that somebody who murdered a family of 10 doesn't get executed, if at all, for like 15 or 20 years. At that time, justice was very swift. First, there weren't any prisons, so you really couldn't put people in prisons for long periods of time. And it was thought that justice should be swift to get the problem taken care of. And since we had a huge backlog of about 30 or 40 accused already in Boston, in Salem, in Ipswich, it was really a clog on the system itself. So the trials commenced, and they commenced according to best principles of English jurisprudence. You would have to go before a grand jury. The grand jury would have to decide whether an indictment was good or not. And in many cases there would be, like, for one person, there would be 4 or 5 indictments that this person afflicted this child, and that child. And sometimes they said, no, there's not enough evidence for this child, so we're not going to indict the person for that. But since they were all capital cases, all you needed was one indictment to go forward. The Attorney General of Massachusetts, newly appointed, was the fellow who was supposed to be in charge of the whole process. He determined, of those people indicted, who the first ones were who would go to trial. And Bridget Bishop turned out to be the first one. And Bridget Bishop was a woman who had been accused of witchcraft previously in the 1680s. We don't have any trial records of that, but we do know that she was under suspicion earlier. She was a resident of Salem, and the Attorney General decided he had the best case against her, so let's take her as the first case. And she was tried in early June of 1692. So the indictment's done, and it's called a true bill when you there's enough evidence to indicate you've got to go to trial. Jurors were picked out of all of the communities of northern Essex County, and it was a jury, I can't remember the number, it wasn't 12, it was maybe 16 or something like that. And they were going to be the ones who would hear the case. And the commissioners, who were like the judges, they didn't make the determination, but they could move the case the way they wanted and ask questions and that sort of thing. If you were tried, you could say, I don't like this juror, I think he's prejudiced, or he's related to a person that hates me. Unfortunately, we're talking mainly about what we would today call middle or lower class people who had not an awful lot of book learning. Some of them could read and write, some of them could only read, and none of them had real formal educations. So they didn't really know what their rights were. And since there weren't any lawyers per se, theoretically the judges were supposed to assist both the accused and the accusers. It made it very difficult. So many of the principles we have today, which are just rights that are used all the time for having things stall and whatever, weren't there at that time.
Right.
But it was a legal procedure in the best tradition of English law, but it still was kind of a kangaroo court, because the judges and most of the people around believed in witchcraft, and they believed that if these innocent, afflicted children who accused these people of hurting them and displayed it in front of people to an amazement of people. I always think that we tend to think these people were rubes and kind of dumb people. No, they weren't. They were human just like we are today, didn't have as much education, didn't understand a lot of stuff, believed in spirits and devils and that kind of thing. So that if something that even today displayed themselves in children behaving very erratically, very scarily, and we still have that today, they thought the devil had a hand in it. And they were very convincing. They were very convincing. That was one of the main reasons why the witchcraft events continued for such a long time, because the maladies they had were scary to people, and I think they would be scary to us today if we saw them in that kind of format.
How did the government of the region, whether it's the town or the regional government, get affected by this? Was there any splashback on the government, or did the government influence any of these legal proceedings?
Well, once Governor Phipps came, there was a process. You'd have to have elections, you'd have to have people go into what we now call the general court, the legislature, and that took a while, so that was formulating. In 1692, we had a new judicial system as well, and the Court of Judicature, which is still running in Massachusetts, traces its beginnings to 1692. The same court that we knew about in 1692 is the Supreme Court of Judicature that we have in Massachusetts today.
And it's in
existence. A different system of government. So we can't say that the present court, their forebears were the ones who executed, because it was a different country. It was England, Great Britain.
Right.
So they were getting around to doing their stuff, but because of the terrible swiftness of witchcraft and all of these people, more and more people every week being put into prison, which wasn't supposed to be used as long-term, only short-term, they had to act on it. So the governor set up this court. Locally, we still have town meetings happening, and the interesting thing is when people think of the witchcraft trials and think of, Rebecca Nurse says at trial that she's innocent as a child unborn. We don't have those trial records. Those are the preliminary hearings that were done locally by local magistrates. So the peculiar thing is, once the witchcraft trials began with Oyer and Termina, they went independently of the local magistrates still having warrants sworn out for so-and-so because he or she was afflicting someone, and they were still having these preliminary hearings happen. So you've got two basically judicial systems going on at the same time. But the local one can only take care of deciding if there's enough evidence to be brought to trial. And then it goes to the court of Oyer and Termina.
And how did this witchcraft hysteria finally end, and what effect did it have on local governance?
The witchcraft continued very strong for about 8 months. But you had over 140, 150 people from about 15 communities in eastern Massachusetts and Maine, which was part of Massachusetts at the time, having people in their communities accused. So it was getting to be a real big backlog. And after a while, you can't be intense, scared to death of what's going to happen. Think of the elections we're having now, how seems like it's been years we've been having all of these election things, and a lot of people are really tense about it. Well, bring it to 1692, and people are tense about it. They're always looking around thinking that maybe my neighbor is a witch, and maybe I'm going to be accused. So that had something to do with it. Also, because we had a judicial system kind of growing at that time, some people filed suit against the families of the children who were accusing their families. And when they got, you know, legal redress to some of these things, I think the parents started saying, let's calm down. Also, the religious within Massachusetts, the ministerial class, with the exception of the ministers who were most involved at the center of witchcraft, the ministers of Salem, Salem Village, and Beverly, who were completely enmeshed in it, and they had people in their congregation who looked like they were witches. The rest of them, the ones who lived in Billerica or Boston or some of the other larger communities, tried to tell the judicial people, slow down. We don't want to make a mistake. Better one guilty goes free than 10 innocent be accused.
Right.
And you also had some people starting, especially the intellectuals, starting to say, I'm not sure if I believe in spectral evidence, the thing in which the girls say they can see the specter invisible to everyone else, afflicting them. And you can't take that as prima facie evidence, because only the accused say they can see this happening. And whereas the children went through, and some of the younger people as well, went through all sorts of torments, it just, how many witches can you have in one community? It is, you know, 140, that's a good chunk of the population of Massachusetts, you know.
So what finally ended it?
It ended on its own weight. Finally, the governor had what was called a general jail delivery, in which he said, let's stop the Court of Iron Termina and let's reconsider, let's reformat. And that's when the new Court of Judicature was formed in early 1693. There were as many trials in 1693 as 92. The difference was, most of the judges were the same, but now the evidence, what they did was they made sure that juries could be made up of not just the moneyed class, the property class, but anyone who is a freeman. Let's be careful on the use of spectral evidence. We've got to have better evidence than that would conform to the best evidence in Old England. And that included more than one person accusing someone or being able to testify against it.
So is this where hearsay does not apply anymore? Because that's always been thrown out.
It's not so much, yeah, it's partially hearsay, but it's also, after 8 months, a lot of people were thinking, this can't be completely true all the time, and what if we're convicting innocent people? And several people who looked like they lived righteous lives had been brought to the gallows. So there was kind of a slow but steady turn in maybe we're not looking at it right. Later on, one of the ministers who was a firm believer in witchcraft, the minister in Beverly, Reverend John Hale, when all of this witchcraft was over, he wrote a manuscript in which he was going to try to prove that they had made mistakes. And he titled his manuscript, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft. And in those days, if somebody picked up a book like that, and it said A Modest Inquiry, That's a catchphrase that in the 17th century meant, we're changing our mind. I'm not going to do the regular spiel because I've got other evidence. However, he was not brave enough to have this manuscript published while he was alive. He asked that it be published afterwards. And what he did in this very interesting book, it wasn't printed until 1702, although the upper class had read it and knew about it, as did the judicial people. One of his early phrases was, "We walked in the clouds and could not find our way." He said that they had used mistaken principles in finding witches. The Bible should be the one sure thing we should look at. And they started using English precedences, dunking witches, having all sorts of tests done, seeing if witch tits were on witches, accused witches' bodies. And he said, this is going to the devil for the devil. We made some real mistakes.
So that is a experience that happened, and as a result of it, I have a question for you that has been expressed at several times. Are the witches still around in Danvers?
I know a lot of people who I call them maybe witches. You know, when you look at the historic facts, there aren't a lot of even fundamental Christians who believe in the concept of witchcraft. Right. Witchcraft began 13th, 14th hundreds and bloomed in the 15 and 1600s, and then kind of dissipated after that. They still believe in literal devils and stuff, but witches, maybe not so much. And those people accused were not practicing witches who were found out. They were total Christians, and especially the ones who were executed, because they would not belie themselves. They would not, life after death in heaven was more important to them than a temporal existence on earth. However, one of the things that kept the witchcraft going so long is that at least 40 and perhaps 50 people accused confessed to being witches. And that, plus what the children went through and how their torture seemed so real, was the thing that continued the process. If somebody says, yes, I am a witch, and they know that thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, they're going to eventually be executed. But what they did was, when a person was accused and confessed, they warehoused them in jail and said, we'll get to you later. But by confessing, they've kind of given up all of their powers. Whereas the ones who would not confess, who obviously were witches, they were the dangerous ones, and they were the ones that the authorities went after.
So the witchcraft hysteria bloomed and then collapsed. However, the governments, or the local governments, remained pretty much the same.
Pretty much, yeah.
And
especially in the rest of Massachusetts. The towns that were affected the most, Andover had more witches come from their community. They had about 40 people accused. Salem Village is next with a good amount of about 20 people accused. They were Democratic in that they accused men and women. It's a little different in Salem, which makes it a little more unique. Usually it was the old hag who looked like she could be a witch that was accused. And also accused were people who weren't just the lower class, as in the beginning of witchcraft, but higher people. Philip English, probably the richest man in all of Massachusetts, lived in Salem. He had a fleet of ships. he and his wife were accused. The difference between upper class people being accused and lower class is upper class had money. They could bribe, or they had people in high places who would let them escape, whereas the poor dregs, had to go through the process. The other thing is, it's not as simple as that, because even the upper class who were accused always had something that made them different. You always go after the people who are different than you. And Philip English, his name was Philippe Anglais, and he was from the Channel Islands. He was more French than English, and therefore he had a mark on him that a lot of Englishmen who maybe resented that he did so well. This Frenchie, how come he does better than I do? I'm a God-fearing person. And we had John Alden, the grandson of John and Priscilla Alden, a man who was very well respected. He was kind of at times he was a rogue, but he was a very important, very well-off man. He was accused just down the street by one of the afflicted children when he was walking. He had come to see what the events were like, and he was caught in on it. So it was a little more democratic than normal witchcraft was. It was a little less sexist, but and those are two of the things that make Salem witchcraft so popular today and such a wonderful kind of research thing to get into. It's a relatively short period of time, 8 months. We've got over 1,000 witchcraft documents, which in old England and in Europe you usually don't have. And such a remarkable set of people whose testimony in preliminary hearings were taken down. So we can hear Rebecca and Urs say, "I'm as innocent as a child unborn." We can hear George Jacobs say, "Well, burn me or hang me, but I'll stand in the truth of Christ." They have all of these neat things that come out that we now look upon as being how heroic these individuals were. And these are generally just common people, people that usually are completely lost to history. And when confronted with the worst thing of their life, in which the civil authorities, the religious authorities, and in some cases even their relatives who said, "You must be a witch because these children say you are," they still said, "You can do with me what you want, but I'm not going to belie myself. I'm innocent of it."
There you go. That's great. Thank you very much for the explanation, because that is something that is very important of how our established government continues.
Yeah.
Break at this stage, and this will be a new subject coming up in a transition from government in the 1800s to the 1930s, in the matter of time, what happened.